Fair enough. So I started out as a legal academic. I got my doctorate in law from Stanford in '95. Came out here, teach at Wits for a little bit. That's the university here. And then I was a legal academic for a short while, and then I was in corporate strategy for a long time, a number of years. And I was out in South Africa working for South African breweries in the corporate strategy arena. I realized as I learned more about rhino and the biology of the situation, I understood that there are ways to save them that we're not fully exploring. So the key elements for me were finding out that rhino horn is removed painlessly and safely, and the animal gets up from the anesthetic and runs off. And most importantly, it grows back. There's this huge difference, this distinction to be made between how a poacher will remove the horn and how a conservationist will remove the horn. Obviously, a poacher wants to incapacitate the animal silently, so sometimes they're hamstrung or whatever else, and then they hack the horn out of a living animal's skull, and they take all the way to the root, and the animal dies from the trauma. And we've lost an animal, and it's been brutalized. Whereas with the conservationist, we dart them with an anesthetic. They go down. The living tissue stops at about this length away from the skull, so we take a safety margin and then cut there, and it's like getting a haircut for a human being. It's dead tissue. There's no nerves, no blood supply, etc. And it grows back constantly. So we cut it and it runs off. And the reason we cut it as conservationists is obviously, one, because it diminishes the poacher's appetite for the animal, but two, and perhaps more importantly, because rhinos kill each other with the horns. That's the primary purpose of the horn in nature. There are not a lot of animals that will tackle a full-grown rhino. In fact, there are none. So within the wild, they don't need it to protect themselves. Black rhino, it is said, sometimes use them to manipulate bushes to bring the leaves within reach. I'm not quite sure of the mechanics of how that could be possible, but white rhino use it only to attack each other. And so in our first year of owning the farm, we lost 5 rhino to intraspecies combat. And rhino will kill each other more commonly than any other African mammal. So it's perfectly natural, but it sucks if your agenda is to save rhino from extinction. To recognize that the first thing you have to save them from is each other is quite an important thing to realize. So we remove the horn regularly. We have to do it every 2 years, because within 3 years they've grown a fully formed weapon again. So every 2 years at the very least, we have to dehorn. And we take it off, and it's under the auspices of the government. It's regulated. We have a member of Limpopo Wildlife present while we do it. We microchip, we DNA test, we measure, we photograph. We mark them. So everything is highly, highly regulated. And it goes in a box, and a secure box. It's locked shut, and it's put in a vault. And from then it starts to degrade. It starts to dry out, to rot. So it's this tremendously valuable resource that is going to waste. Meanwhile, that night, we might have somebody try to break into the farm, and we've had this attempted repeatedly, to kill an animal that's got just the base, the part that we left because we didn't want to hurt the animal. That can be 3 kilos sometimes. And so they'll kill the animal for that even. And meanwhile, we might have taken 5 kilos off. We could have satisfied market demand. And people say, oh, but you'll never send as much horn out as the poachers take. Well, we know from poaching statistics that they're taking about 5 tons of horn out a year. And that's, of course, largely going, if not exclusively going, to the Asian market. 5 tons is nothing. We have 7,500 rhino in private reserves hands. On average, across each, you'll get about a kilo per animal per year. A full-grown male will produce north of 2 kilos a year, a female slightly less, but you've got younger animals, older animals. So let's say on average, a very conservative 1 kilo per animal per year. 7,500 animals in private hands. That means we, just in South Africa, in private reserves, generate 7.5 tons a year. So already that's 1.5 times what the poachers are getting out to Asia. But on top of that, then there are the government reserves, which are also dehorning, and they generate multiple tons a year. Then there are Namibians, and they're dehorning, and they generate multiple tons a year. And then, of course, we've got about 65 to 70 tons in storage already between us all. So if you do the math on how quickly the herds grow and how much we can put into the market, it's mathematically obvious that we can swamp this market. We can put more than 5 times what the poachers are getting every year into the market without a single animal dying or even being hurt. And so that's a no-brainer. What happens when you put 5 times the supply into the market? The price plummets. So there already we've hurt the business of poaching if we haven't ended it already. But on top of that, instead of the money going to the poaching syndicates who currently profit when when they kill an animal, the money would go into those who aren't getting any, the conservationists' hands. So we have no income stream. All of this has to be funded out of our own private reserves, if you will. So I made money in business. I put it into trying to save the rhino. That's noble. It's also stupid, because without income, all that happens is we will eventually run out, and then this exercise will have been a failed exercise, and the animals that we currently protect will be unprotected yet again. So you have to have revenue to make this sustainable. It has to be. And if we could sell the horn, then we bring in revenue. And enough revenue that we can absolutely end poaching, because poaching happens for two reasons. One, it's lucrative. Two, it's low risk. We can hurt the one side by swamping the market with horn. I mean, how many businessmen go into a business saying, we will destroy this business on purpose? That's our goal. We want to destroy the business that might make us money. But that's what we're into. We want to destroy the business, so we want to throw horn at the market and bring the price down. But on top of that, even if that doesn't work, what happens when we bring in revenue is we can afford to secure our own reserves. So right now I have guys on motorcycles. They'll deploy in the next hour or so, and they're going to run around my farm constantly armed and on comms, and we communicate, and we've got sensors in the fences and electrified fences all around, and we're constantly on the lookout. But that's a very inefficient way, to be perfectly honest, of securing the environment. If I could afford it, I'd put radar and thermal cameras up, and there are 2 reserves that I know of that have radar and thermal cameras, and they're impregnable. They haven't been poached in 5 years. And it's just, the technology is there, but it's very difficult to afford. If we could bring some revenue in, we could guarantee that these animals stay safe. And also, once you do the economics and you figure out how much horn an animal produces, how much money that could bring into the reserve, and therefore if you play that out for the 40-year lifespan of the animal, dehorning them every 2 years, how much money that animal is worth today, you end even legal hunting, because nobody in their right mind is going to allow somebody from overseas to come over for a meager couple of million rand and shoot an animal that's worth 40 million rand. And if you actually play out the cash flows based on current market pricing, now of course that market price might plummet when we swamp the market with horn. On the other hand, we might actually see demand somewhat grow to match that supply as market realizes that there is ethical horn out there. Whatever happens to price, though, the bottom line is that the reserves will make more than enough to sustain themselves, and the conservation goal that they're seeking to satisfy will be reached. And we will strip that money out of the illegal, illicit market. That is the only group that profits today. So to me, this is a no-brainer. The question, of course, arises, so I break the question into 2 parts. Should we have a legal market in horn? And if we should, how can we have a legal market in horn? The should is the part that I think I've addressed, at least to my satisfaction. I don't know about other people's satisfaction already. The how can we question is one that really stumps people, and that's where everybody gets caught up on CITES. And it's where, I'm not a great farmer, actually. I don't farm this place. We don't farm anything. We farm wild Africa, so we're really just preserving a natural habitat. But the guy responsible for that is not me. It's Barent, who actually knows what he's doing. And I'm an ex-legal academic. I'm a nerd. I don't know how to farm Africa. What I do bring to the party is an understanding of the legal parameters of CITES and how one can navigate that to the betterment of what we're trying to achieve. And the truth is that people talk about a prohibition, a 40-year ban on trade in rhino horn, and that's nonsense. CITES doesn't even attempt to impose a ban on anything. All CITES does, it says there are Appendix 1 animals, Appendix 2 animals, Appendix 3 animals, and we assign different levels of protection to each of those. The very highest level, Appendix 1, the most endangered animals, what CITES seeks to do is to prohibit the import of any product related to those animals for primarily commercial purposes. That means it doesn't in any way impose a limitation on the export, only on the import, and only then if it's for primarily commercial purposes. And all sorts of things fall outside of that. So if it's primarily medicinal purposes, well, then it's legal. Now, what is it that Asia actually buys for primarily? They do carve the items, but the majority of the horn product is used for medicinal purposes. We can believe that, we cannot believe it. It doesn't matter. There are billions of people who do believe it, and we need to come to grips with that and satisfy it in a way that doesn't hurt the animals, instead of insisting that the only way you can get horn is by poaching an animal, killing it. So even on Appendix 1, you can trade. But the thing is, CITES very wisely in Article 7, paragraphs 4 and 5 provides for captive breeding exemptions. So any animal that is bred in captivity is automatically dropped from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2 in terms of its treatment for trade. That means it can be legally traded for commercial purposes even, with very few limitations. The only thing is the scientific authorities on both sides of that equation, export and import, need to both confirm that such trade would be non-detrimental for the species in the wild. South African National Scientific authority has ruled and published their ruling that, of course, this would not be detrimental because these animals are in captivity. Satisfying the need for horn from them would save them, save the wild ones and the captive ones from poaching. But also, certainly, as you look around, this hardly looks like a captive environment. I mean, we're not keeping them in cages. I've had debates with people on Facebook about how can you keep them in captivity, a feedlot environment. This isn't a feedlot. We just drove around for 10 minutes. We hardly saw any rhino. I can't find them on some days. This is thousands upon thousands of acres with 150 rhino on it. And a little bit down the road, there's thousands and thousands of acres with another 150 rhino on it. If the rhino don't want to be seen that day, they're not seen that day. So this is captivity, but it's hardly captivity. But if we can trade the horn from animals that are kept in these safe environments and save all of them, well, then that's a great thing. So long as those scientific authorities say that, and it comes from a captive-bred environment, which we satisfy legally, it's I can go into detail on it. No one wants to hear the details, so let's just skip through that and say we satisfy the captive breeding requirements. Then we can trade. And really the only thing that is keeping us from trade at this point is a combination of lack of understanding from the governments involved, fear, some measure of corruption in some of the states, because those who are in charge sometimes are selling horn illicitly and don't want a legal market to end their monopoly there, and political will. People see the rhino, in South Africa and Namibia. I think the powers that be feel rhino are a pain in the butt. I got to spend hundreds of millions protecting these bloody animals, and meanwhile, I've got a voting population that doesn't have adequate schooling, adequate housing, and those are legitimate concerns. What they don't understand is how much money could be brought into this country. We engaged the services of Dr. Azar Jamin, who's one of the top economists in this country. He's the head of a firm called Econometrics, and he ran some analysis that suggested that at the time, based on the numbers of rhino in South Africa, there were 800 billion rand to be made for government's coffers within the next 5 years from legalizing rhino horn trade. A total of 1.1 trillion rand would come into the economy, with the difference between those two numbers going to the private reserves that are keeping the animals alive and safe. Those are astonishing numbers. I mean, what we could do as a country with 800 billion rand in government hands. Now, of course, there are people out there who are going to laugh into their beer and say, yeah, they'll just steal it. And of course, that's a possibility. But I'd like to think that a large portion of that money will find its way into hospitalization for those who need it, schools for those who need it, rural electrification, housing for the poor. Even better law enforcement, which is what we're really struggling with as well out in the rural areas. There are so many things we can achieve with that money. So this is a no-brainer. Once you understand the full landscape, it saves the animals, it saves the country's economy, it saves the political agenda of those who've made promises that they cannot sustain economically. It's a good thing all around, but there's not adequate understanding, and that's primarily what I do. Is I work with governments and various organizations to promote that understanding of how we can do what we need to do. Because like I said, I can't bring better animal husbandry to this farm. Pete is a tremendous farmer, and his legacy stays on here now that we've bought it from him. Barent is a tremendous farmer. I'm not going to add to that, but I can bring the strategic and legal aspect to it.